The last government policy we're going to look at is what we call supply-side policies. The definition of supply-side policies are any policies that seek to increase the quantity or quality of a nation's factors of production. This is the exact same thing we talked about on the PPC, that any actions that will push the PPC out so I can produce more of R and more of S, that's going to be the exact same thing that we're talking about here in increasing quantity and quality of factors of production. In macroeconomics, of course, this is seen as a shift of aggregate supply to the right, whether it be on our Keynesian diagram here or on the neoclassical diagram that we'll look at next. It's important to distinguish the role of intent in supply-side policies. For example, when we talked about demand-side policies and fiscal policy, we talked about lowering income tax rates as a way to increase C and I, therefore to increase aggregate demand. Well, lowering taxes is also a supply-side policy, but the reason they're doing it is different. The reason that people would, supply-side economists would want to lower taxes is because they think that businesses will be more willing to hire workers and produce goods and services if their costs are lowered, and they think that consumers will be more willing to go work longer hours if they get to hold on to more of their money. So, even though the policy is the same to lower taxes, the intent is different. And that might lead us to different outcomes over the long term, because if your intent is to increase aggregate supply, you're probably going to want to keep tax rates perpetually low. Whereas for a demand-side policy, once aggregate demand is closer to where it should be, you might raise tax rates back up. When we look at supply-side policies on the Keynesian diagram, one thing should be noticed. For the most part, Keynesians aren't going to see a need to increase aggregate supply. Remember, Keynesians for the most part are obsessed with aggregate demand, but even then, there are some times where they say, well, of course, aggregate supply needs to improve as well. No Keynesian would say that, the aggregate supply curve for whatever nation today is, the same as it was 50 or 100 years ago. For the Keynesians, the difference is going to be, is the equilibrium point based on the current amount of aggregate demand, where is it in relation to YFE? Remember, they don't clearly define where YFE is, but we can always tell if we look over at the price level. If people feel like the price level is too high, if they feel like inflation is a problem, then we must be somewhere past YFE. So in this case, you could shift aggregate demand to the left, and like we talked about under demand-side policies, they might take measures to keep aggregate demand from shifting too quickly to the right, but at the same time, they need some space to grow. I think of back when I was a kid and you would go buy new shoes. Well, you always bought your new shoes with plenty of room because everybody knew in the next, 4 or 5 months your foot was going to get a lot bigger, so you needed space to grow. So in the same way, increasing aggregate supply is going to give us room for further increases to Y. So just by shifting from AS1 to AS2, we see already that with the same amount of aggregate demand, that national income would move from Y1 over to Y2. More importantly, Y2 would be somewhere to the left of the new level of national income at full employment. So now, from this point, there's room for further increases to aggregate demand without price levels coming up too much. In the neoclassical monetarist diagram, obviously we're going to see some different results. In this, what we're going to see is, first of all, we have to keep in mind that long-run aggregate supply and short-run aggregate supply are going to move as a unit. Remember, long-run aggregate supply is about a nation's quantity and quality of factors of production, basically their productive capacity, and short-run aggregate supply brings in the element of input costs being fixed or not fixed. So it would be pretty hard to argue that our long-run capacity is more, but for some reason our short-run costs haven't decreased. Of course, if we improve our technology, if we have more factors of production, we're going to see price levels or input price levels go down as well. An important note to make is that as we see aggregate supply moved to the right, the short-run aggregate supply curve would be traveling down the existing aggregate demand curve. And we might think that that's going to lead to prices being lower or something like that. So again, it's important to note that even though this is a supply-side belief of what would happen, there are going to be changes to aggregate demand. A key tenet of supply-side economists and the neoclassical school of thought is that supply creates its own demand. This goes way back to the 1800s to a French economist called Jean-Baptiste Say, and this is referred to as Say's law. Essentially what it's saying is that what we see at arrow A, so as long-run and short-run aggregate supply move to the right, a result is going to be what we see at arrow B, that aggregate demand is also going to move to the right. Now, if we think about it, it's rather simple. As short-run aggregate supply moves to the right and moves down aggregate demand, what we would see is that national income would be increasing more and more and more. But instead of what we talked about when we talked about the neoclassical critique of the other policies, that we're moving past long-run aggregate supply and that short-run aggregate supply would shift back to the left, here, again for the same reason that space to grow or room to grow is being created, that national income would continue to go up and up and up. As this occurs, what this means is that there's more I and more C. People have more money to spend, both businesses and consumers. Therefore, that money is in the circular flow, and we're going to see increases to aggregate demand. And ultimately, what you see in this model most of the time when you draw it up is that price level is going to be very consistent when you're in long-run equilibrium. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below.